If we were, we could talk about it and we could move on, but we don't talk about it, and so we can't.
To your point about President Obama, whose name has come up a few times already in this conversation, and it's hard to avoid when you talk about color blindness in the age of Obama. Let's just walk through some of these issues right quick. When the president is asked specifically about black unemployment, his answer, you know, famously or infamously, is a rising tide will lift all boats. Same answer, by the way, Ronald Reagan gave, that a rising tide will lift all boats. That's his answer on black unemployment. You ask him about education in black America, he says the education reform will benefit everybody in America. We know the disparity between the education, the achievement gap, but his answer is that education reform will benefit everybody. You asking about black folk who are clearly on the wrong end of the healthcare debate, his answer is that healthcare reform will benefit all African Americans. I mean, you can walk down the list. You ask him about anything specific, no matter how far and how wide the gap is between black and white, his answer is that a universal approach will benefit everybody. Why won't that dog hunt as you see it?
Right. Well, the reason it won't, let's take healthcare, for instance. I mean, a lot of people believe that the reason there are disparities between white and black folks in terms of health outcomes is just money. Black folks don't have access, they don't have insurance. If they did, things would be better. Now, there's truth in that, but there's also falsehood. The fact is, even when people of color have health insurance, have good jobs, have decent incomes, they have worse health outcomes. Black women, for example, with college degrees, good jobs, and health care, who had prenatal care all throughout the time of the gestation of their children, still have worse outcomes for their newborn children, higher infant mortality than white women who dropped out of school after 8th grade, don't have insurance, and didn't have any prenatal care at all. That's not about money. What is that about? I talk about in the book two things. Number one, the research is clear: unequal treatment by doctors. Doctors are not bigots, but they have implicit subconscious biases just like everyone, and they don't treat patients equally. And secondly, the research, now 15 or 20 studies in the last decade, find that the cumulative effect of discrimination on black and brown bodies is having a health consequence. It's called a weathering effect. And over time, the stress, the anxiety that is caused by racism and discrimination has actual physiological impact. Universal care is good, but it can't deal with that unless we proclaim racism a public health crisis and start to look at discrimination as a health issue. We can't solve that problem.
So white folks say that this ain't a racist country, we just elected a black man president. But then there are black folk who say, and I love, you've been white a long time, I've been black a long time. I'm a part of this club, so I hear this all the time. He ain't the president of black America, he's the president of all of America. He didn't cause the oil spill, he didn't tank the economy, he didn't start the wars. You get the sense that no matter what the challenges are, and that's why we elect a president to manage these crises. But black folk are so, on the one hand, happy about him being president, and on the other hand, so protective of him being maltreated. I mean, let's be honest about this. There's so many threats on this guy's life every day. You know, we saw how the Tea Party and other activists have acted. We saw these black members of Congress being spat upon and called nigger. I mean, we've seen the evidence, it's clear. Secret Service budget has increased since Obama's been president. So what do you say to these black people who don't want to push back too hard on him because he didn't cause all these problems, he's just doing the best he can?
Well, I mean, the protectionism makes perfect sense. And look, there's no question that this is a president who inherited an awful lot of problems. But I tend to take the position that our mutual friend Michael Eric Dyson has taken, I believe you've taken it as well, which is, it's not that we're asking President Obama to do more than any white president would around the issue of civil rights and racism, but he also shouldn't be allowed to do less. And the reality is, if those of us in the public, and not just him, I mean, it really isn't just his job, if we continue to raise this issue, you've done it, I try to do it, lots of folks are doing it, we can continue to push forward an understanding of the way race operates in this country, which leaves him then very little wiggle room to get out of that problem. I don't expect him to raise the issue. I don't expect him to stand up and even do what Bill Clinton did, which is say we're going to have a national conversation on race, which of course didn't go very far. But I do expect that when the question is put to him, just like any president, that he will lead on it. And what I talk about in the book that I think is critical for folks to know, white, black, or otherwise, is that the politics of this idea that, well, the president can't talk about race because the backlash will be so great. The research actually suggests, and I was surprised by it when I uncovered it, the research says that in fact racism is more effective when it operates subliminally, when you don't call it out, when you don't mention it, because if white Americans, for example, are able to hide behind a veil of innocence and say, oh, my opposition to healthcare reform isn't about race, no, it's not that at all, then they're able to content themselves with the idea that they're not doing anything wrong. The research has found, however, that when people are made to understand the role that race is having on them subconsciously. When you drag it out into the light, when you make it part of the conversation, most people, good news, are good folks. Most people don't want to hurt other people. So when you allow them very little opportunity to hide behind that veil of innocence and ignorance, then they will be more likely to act in an equitable fashion. So in fact, the politics of this, based on the research, actually suggests that if he would talk about it more, if we would talk about it more, it might have a positive effect on racial amity and racial attitudes and racial progress, as opposed to a backlash effect. The more we don't talk about it, the easier it is for folks to say, oh, it's not about that. No, it's not.
Well, if I were part of the Obama machine, I'm not, but if I were, my response, my retort to that would be, come on, Tim. If your argument is that we're not stepping up enough talking about race, we are, the administration, we are accused already by certain people of being tribal.
Right.
And we ain't talking about race
in
the way you want us to.
Well, and that's all the more reason to go ahead and have the conversation. If you're going to be accused anyway of only pushing health care as a reparations for slavery scheme, which is what Glenn Beck has said and what Rush Limbaugh has said, if they're going to go there anyway, when you don't fight back, when you don't respond and take on the issue of race directly, it actually, I think, makes you look weak, and I think it allows the opposition to draw first blood and never have to worry about being punched back.
But it's one thing for Glenn Beck and Rush Limbaugh to preach that. I don't think the White House is concerned about that. What happens, though, when moderates, when independents who supported this president start to buy into the notion that he's behaving in a tribal way, looking out for the brothers and sisters?
Well, I think that's why I'm not suggesting, and I don't in the book, that President Obama needs to be putting this out front, in the front of his agenda. I think it's about what you said. When he's asked the question about the uniquely depression-level unemployment in Black America, he needs to say more than rising tide. He needs to talk about the specific things that are going to be done. Not because he's only going to help Black folks. Obviously, the universal stuff, I don't know anyone on the left of the spectrum who doesn't believe in universal health care, who doesn't believe in more money for jobs and more money for schools. But you also have to deal with the specificity. A lot of the stuff I talk about in the book, the good news isn't even about what government has to do. I'd like to see him do more. I'd like to see congressional Democrats do more. But the truth is, a lot of the stuff that we in this country can do to move forward the agenda for racial equity, we can do in our own lives, we can do with our children. I'm a father of 2 little girls. A lot of this is about the conversations we do or don't have in the home. A lot of it is about what we do and don't require our teachers to do in their schools. A lot of it has to do with what employers can do, whether or not the government says they have to step up and to realize the role that racism continues to play and the role that subtle bias that we all have internalized, according to the research, plays in affecting how we evaluate job applicants, how we evaluate college applicants. If I am more aware of that, which is one of the things I'm trying to make people more aware of with the book, then I'm going to try harder to make sure that I don't act on the basis of those internalized biases. The problem is if we don't talk about those internalized biases, we cannot check them. You can't check the behavior that you're not aware of.
Assess for me, given your research and the way you study this, assess for me how well or not so well Black leaders are doing the dance with the president. It's one thing for the president to not want to touch these issues for whatever reason, or to approach it in the way that you and others think he ought to approach it. Right. He's the president, but he's not a member of Congress. Right. He's not the head of a Black national organization. He ain't running the NAACP. He ain't running the Urban League. He's not running the National Action Network. He's not running Rainbow Push Coalition. We can do this all day long. Assess for me how Black leaders are stepping up to or abrogating their responsibility in the tradition of the freedom struggle to raise these issues no matter who's in the White House. Right.
Well, I mean, I think they're in a tough spot. And I know some of those leaders. I know Mark Morial. I've known him for many years. I know Reverend Sharpton. I know some of the folks who are obviously involved in this conversation. And they're in between, sort of these two poles of, on the one hand, wanting to have influence, and understandably so, and believing that they will have an audience in a way that they wouldn't have had with previous presidents. But at the same time, I think the role of the activist, and this is just good history, the role of the activist, whether it's a Black activist or a white ally acting in solidarity with people of color, is to always push from the outside those on the inside and to remind them of the role of the movement in making progress. We are right now in this year looking at the 50th anniversary of the founding of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And what SNCC proved beyond any question is you couldn't just sit around and wait for John F. Kennedy or Lyndon Johnson to quote unquote do the right thing. It took people on the outside pushing, even though those were people relative to Nixon or Reagan who were more favorable to civil rights, they still had to be pushed.